Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the FitBigStrong podcast. My name is Ashton, the host of the FitBigStrong podcast, and today's episode is all about powerlifting. Specifically, when we program, should we be using RPE or percentages? This debate has been going on for too long, and there are so many opinions. I thought I would kind of summarize what is RPE with examples, what is percentage with examples, their advantages and disadvantages, and then kind of a discussion of what should you do and what is basic, like who's using what, like at what level is what strategy being implemented. So let's get straight into it. I'm not going to waste your time. What is RPE? Well, RPE is the rate of perceived exertion. Ooh, that sounds really scary. What does that mean? Well, it's basically a subjective measurement of how you feel during your set. Originally, interestingly enough, RPE was based on heart rate. So it was a scale of 6 to 20, and it meant to correlate with heart rate for exercise. So if you're like, how's this feeling out of 6 to 20, you'd be like, oh, 14. And then that would approximately correlate to a heart rate of 140 beats per minute, which therefore correlated with how hard you're training. So from a exercise prescription approach, it was really effective, especially for cardiovascular training, which is what it was correlated for. So that was really interesting. And then basically these powerlifters who don't do cardio showed up and were like, let's adapt this. And so it's been adapted to a 1 to 10 scale, basically, which is cool. 1 to 10. So we've basically shaved off 4 numbers and then shifted the scale down. But what's that even correlated with? Well, generally, let's say an RPE 10 means you have no more reps in the tank. An RPE 8 means you might have 2 reps in the tank, or it feels like an 8 out of 10 difficulty, or it feels like a 10 out of 10 max effort difficulty, and that goes all the way down to 1. So 1 might be you're sitting on the couch and you've just done some lateral raises, 3 reps of 1 kilo, and let's say you can bench 50 kilos for a couple reps. It's going to be very easy. But RPE 10 might be world record attempt, full max effort. So that's kind of what RPE is correlated with. Given that I just mentioned, it represents reps in reserve or reps in the tank, you might consider RPE the inverse of reps in reserve. So what I mean is, in hypertrophy training, people often say, I have 1 rep in reserve. So you have 1 rep till basically failure. That might be considered an RPE 9. Okay, cool. So you might want to consider RPE as an inverse scale, especially in the powerlifting hypertrophy range, which is 5 to 10, or 5 to 12, but especially in that 5 to 10 rep range, RPE is often just an inverse of reps in reserve. Just to quickly clarify what reps in reserve is, that's basically how many reps you have left until complete technical failure. So yeah, if you flared your elbows a bit more and you half repped it, you could get more reps, but that isn't standardized. So technical failure assumes that the musculature involved and your ability to control that with consistent form has been reduced. So therefore, once that happens, for example, you're doing RDLs and, you start to bend your knees a bit more, or you start to round your back, you've already hit technical failure. So you're at 0 reps in reserve, or even beyond failure, which is where you keep going with poor form. So that's what reps in reserve is. So why did I mention 5 to 10 and not 1 to 10? When we get heavier, things change with RPE. For example, a top single at RPE 9, you might be able to add like 5 kilos to your lift for that single, but not necessarily do another rep. If you've got any experience in powerlifting, you'll know that to be true. And so, for lighter reps, let's say in the 3 to 10 reps in most cases, it almost requires less of a drive and a motivation to lift. And so RPE becomes more correlated with reps in reserve because it's not necessarily about your perception of the lift. It's about being focused enough to be able to perform the lift, given enough intensity. And so, in my experience though, there needs to be an exponentially higher level of arousal or motivation, let's say, for doubles and singles to truly hit them at high RPEs. Like, you need to be in the zone, focused, getting everything firing. Because a maximal effort attempt, or perceiving a maximal effort attempt to be easy, requires that drive and that passion and that focus. And so as you approach these heavier, higher RPE singles and doubles, that's where RPE becomes more disassociated with reps in reserve and becomes more about how it felt. And that's more relevant when we're going to talk about the advantages. And so it seems that RPE is uniquely relevant to powerlifting because we don't care about how many reps you have left. We care about how much more weight you can add to the lift in competition. And so keep that in mind. Here's a great example as well. How something feels is incredibly important to the success of a lift. If you're not feeling great for your squats, 80% of your 1 rep max can feel heavy on your back. And you could rep that for like 6, but it feels heavy. All else equal, if you're completely amped up and ready, and you've got like loads far exceeding your 1 rep max, maybe it's 105, 110% of your 1 rep max, 10% more than you've ever lifted in your life, you might not even feel the bar on your back because you're so amped up. Like, that's a thing. And so how we perceive the weight is important because if you move your 1 rep max at RPE 9, you've got more reps. It's important that we have a calibrated understanding of your RPE. And this just comes with practice and feedback. For example, if it feels like a 5, but an experienced lifter looks at that and goes, man, you got like way more left because like you just haven't got that calibration. It needs to be calibrated. So that's an example of having that calibrated. Or it feels like, oh yeah, that felt really good, but it was literally an RPE 10 grinder. You can't add more weight. That was RPE 10. It wasn't RPE 7. You know what I mean? And so it's important to have that calibrated understanding. And you get a lot of that with practice and coaching feedback. So, how do we progress RPE? What's an example of what we might do within our training? Well, you might start off your block. Let's say it's weeks 1 to 4. You got a 4-week accumulation. You might start up at 6 and go to 9. Or you might go from 7 to 10. So week 1 is RPE 7 for your single. Then it goes RPE 8. Then it goes RPE 9. And then it goes RPE 10. Or I'm not saying that's a good strategy. In a lot of cases, as we're going to discuss, might not be. But that's how we do it. We increase RPE as we progress through the block because that pushes us closer to the limit. How something feels is often correlated with how much you can lift if it's calibrated. So in theory, if you increase your RPE throughout the week, your RPE prescription, you're going to therefore increase the load. And so you're directly increasing you're literally progressing, simple as that. But RPE allows for increases and decreases throughout the week. So if you hit an RPE 7 single, and then next week you go, let's hit an RPE 8 single, but you were under recovered, and so you did less load, and it felt heavier, RPE allows for that. It's flexible in nature. So what are the minimum training intensities when using RPE? What is like, from an overload threshold dynamics perspective of like, how much do I need to lift to reliably stimulate results? What is the minimum RPE intensity threshold? Well, in most cases, that's RPE 7 or above to reliably stimulate results. In the case of like technique work, introductory volume work, beginners, and let's say week 1 load selections for like triples and above, RPE 5 to 6 can be useful. Technique work is not meant to be heavy. When you've just come back from a block and you're doing volume, you're extremely sensitive to volume and you're very untrained. So you will reliably see adaptations the following week if you use a lighter RPE. Beginners grow on almost any form of training. So they will grow doing RPE 5. And for most people, when you experience RPE 5 is like light. So week 1 load selections for triples, singles, doubles. Since the sheer load is so high, despite the RPE, minimum intensity, not being met, the actual percentage 1 rep max threshold has been met. And so you generally do receive reliable results. And there's no reason, there's also an injury risk associated with pushing heavy singles. So why would you do it if you can, week 1, maybe week 2, get results by doing a lower RPE? Just things to think about. So it's like RPE, there's cases where you can go lower and it's beneficial, but for the most part, to reliably stimulate results, you need to be RPE 7. Why not just start your training at higher RPEs, right? Closer to failure is heavier, so more results, right? Well, on a per set basis, you are correct in that thinking. But we don't program on a per set basis. We have to consider the implications week to week and even block to block. Going from RPE 8 to 9 is exponentially more fatiguing than going from 7 to 8, right? So the amount of fatigue, because we're approaching failure. So think about this. If we go RPE 6 to 7, that 7, let's say, creates 1.1 times the stimulus, but also gives you, let's say, 1.1 times the fatigue. So it's relative. Let's go from RPE 8 to 9. Let's say you also see an increase in stimulus of 1.1, but the fatigue, let's say, is 1.4. So your stimulus to fatigue ratio is decreasing. You're increasing the stimulus on a per set basis, but now you have more fatigue. So let's say you're going from RPE 9 to 10, also a 1.1% increase, or 1.1 times increase in your stimulus. Great. But then a 1.7 times increase in fatigue. So now, mathematically, you can see that the ratio from stimulus to fatigue is really, really, really bad doing RPE 10 compared to doing RPE 6, 7, and even 8. So there's a problem here because fatigue cost, which is what that fatigue problem is, raises injury risk and also prevents weekly progressions because you're just carrying so much fatigue. If you want to learn a bit more about what fatigue actually is, I did a podcast on recovery where we broke that down. And I've also, on my Instagram, you'll see I've created posts such as what is stimulus to fatigue ratio, which kind of breaks down fatigue a little bit. Those are 2 resources I recommend checking out if you're confused about the topic of fatigue at the moment. But to carry on, carrying fatigue is not ideal, and for lots of reasons. And if you want to know why carrying fatigue as a powerlifter is also a bad idea, I did a podcast called Periodization for Powerlifters. Wow, I'm really plugging myself here. But I just don't want to break down fatigue again because I've done it like 4 times at this point. On Periodization for Powerlifters, we talk about the importance of fatigue management and why you why certain training blocks, let's say a strength block, you want to kind of sit in a moderate fatigue environment. Those are some resources to check out, but that's why we don't start at higher RPEs, because we reliably get results at lower RPEs with less fatigue. And then so in week 2, we can increase the RPE a little bit to increase, obviously, the progression. We need to progressively overload, but we also don't drastically increase RPE. Week 4, let's say last week before we deload, what we do is we push the RPE, because who cares? Next week we're deloading. Like, the goal is for the deload to drop the fatigue. And so we push as hard as we can, raw stimulus magnitude, so to speak, and then we deload, start fresh. Next block, we start at we go back down to low RPE, but this time it's heavier because we've made progress. If that doesn't make sense, please check out my other resources I linked. I verbally linked. I'm not going to link them. You can find them yourself. Wow, that was really rude, Ashton. Okay. Percentage. What is percentage training as a powerlifter? Well, you basically program a load percentage for your lifts using your 1 rep max or your estimated 1 rep max. The idea is similar to RPE, except the load is determined by a percentage rather than how you feel. It's very standardized. So for example, how we'd program this, we might go, let's say 4x4 at 75%. And then next week, we do 77.5%. And we increase in 2.5% increments week to week, let's say for 4 weeks. And then we deload at a 2x2 at 70%. Well, that's one way to do it. But that's an example of how we might program it. So we make calculated direct increases in volume and intensity, and then we plan the deload. And simple as that, you get outcome. That's really cool, right? And then so minimum intensity thresholds. Again, this is back to what do I need to be lifting in order to reliably stimulate results? Well, unlike RPE, which solves this problem with relative intensity, which we're going to describe what that is in a second. Chill out. For hypertrophy, for powerlifting hypertrophy, if you're lifting above 60% of your 1 rep max, for strength, if you're getting 75% 1 rep max or above, and for peaking, 85% plus, you're reliably stimulating results. So, and even with strength, you might get away with like 70%, but 75% is like pretty good. And also consider that the rep range determines your load, like your percentage prescription. So for example, if you need to be training close to failure to stimulate results. And so as the reps drop, your percentage intensity needs to increase. As your reps increase, you need to drop the percentage to account, because you can't just rep your 1 rep max for 10 reps. So you can't do that. It's got to be at a certain percentage scale. See, percentage is really basic, and so there wasn't really much to learn about it in regards to that's just what it is. So let's break down the advantages and disadvantages of each strategy. Let's begin with RPE. Okay, so reliability in your stimulus. Assuming you're accurate with your RPE, on a per set basis, stimulus is accounted for. Because if you take a set to true RPE 10, regardless of the rep range, anywhere between 5 to 30, you will stimulate muscle growth. If you do that same approach with anything above 6 reps, you will reliably stimulate strength gains. Same with any rep range. So as long as you are within the minimum intensity threshold of RPE 7, regardless of the rep range, you will reliably stimulate results. So that's something really cool to note, is that as long as you have things right, you will get result. And that makes it makes life very easy, especially for research, because if they just say, just hit muscular failure or RPE 10, and that's an actual true RPE 10, you get standardized stimulus for your studies. So, It also allows flexibility in regards to recovery. Let's say, are you under recovered? That's okay. Aim to hit what you can at RPE 7 or RPE 8. And that's good because we live in a world and we don't all live in the perfect bubble. Things change, stress happens, that's life. And so a system which allows for flexibility is good because if you can't hit the numbers, you can't hit the numbers. And so what we could then do is we could note down that, oh, look, we wanted this to be a good day at RPE 8, but you couldn't lift the loads we expected you to lift. We write this down and we look for the problem. Maybe you didn't eat enough. Maybe you stayed up, with your girlfriend. Lots of things. Or actually, you're a powerlifter. You stayed up watching YouTube Sigma grind set videos. You don't have a girlfriend. So we can create almost micro goals. For example, I want this weight to feel at this RPE. So let's say you had if you know that if I hit 100 kilos at RPE 8, I will therefore be able to hit 110 kilos at RPE 10. So if you make a 100 kilo jump and it moves like an RPE 8, you can build confidence with certain loads. And that's really useful. In competition, how do you communicate what you have left in the tank? Like how? With a calibrated understanding of RPE, you're able to estimate the total load you can tolerate. So for example, if it's an RPE 8 relative to you, because you've developed this skill, you know you have 7.5 kilos left for your next attempt. Or you can plan attempts based on RPE and know the relative jumps you can make. That's a very, 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 very big benefit, guys. It's like, are you seriously going to tell your coach, yeah, like that felt like 82.5% of my 1 rep max. I think we can increase it by like 5%. What the fuck are you talking about? It's like, that doesn't make sense. That's not easily communicatable. And so RPE is really advantageous in comp because how it feels determines how much you can lift, especially if how you feel is accurate. And if you've got experience, it will be accurate. So people who be like, yeah, RPE is useless. It's like, what are you going to do in comp? Are you going to make percentage jumps? Like, yeah, sure. But like, that's just so variable. How do you manage that? That would drive me crazy. It's like, you feel like shit, but we're still going to make this 105% jump. Like, maybe that's a bit of an over-exaggeration. But the point is, like, it's not an easily communicatable language. Sorry. I get passionate sometimes. And so, accessories become easier to program certain intensities. Are you going to 1 rep max or estimate 1 rep max all your accessories? It's like, what? No, of course you're not going to do that. Let's max out my lateral array so we can program a certain percentage. Let's max out my bicep curl. I mean, don't do that. I know some of you guys want to do that, but don't do it. And so it's like maxing out your glute hamstring raise. Like, just doesn't make sense. And so assuming you're accurate with your RPE, it allows for accessories to be dosed appropriately. Notice how I said, as long as you're within RPE 7 and that's correct, regardless of the rep range, you're stimulating results. Great. So what you could do is be like, yeah, RDLs 3x8 at RPE 7. And then you could do like bent over rows at RPE 7. It's like, that makes sense. That works. It's like, be within 3 reps in reserve. And if you truly know what that feels like, which you will develop over time, that's a really good way to standardize things. And so how's about, thresholds for rehab? How something feels is important to know when you're performing rehab. So for example, maybe if you're feeling below a 2 out of 10 threshold for pain, maybe you can progress your rehab a little bit more. Because if it's low pain and you're progressing, awesome. Maybe you can increase the rate of progression towards a more difficult movement. But let's say you jump in and the person's like, 7 out of 10 pain. Well, maybe you're being too invasive with your approach, and you probably are. One thing I like to do is stay below 3 out of 10 threshold for pain, and then use that to work on very disadvantaged movements. So for example, if someone has had issues with their knees and patellar tendonitis and all that good stuff, we'll strip volume back, strip intensity back, and let's say in this case, we might do like a tempo goblet squat, just to get some form of movement in. And then we might go, okay, do not exceed 3 out of 10 pain. So they literally might just be holding a 5 kilo dumbbell and they can do 2 sets of 10 or 2 sets of 8 with a tempo and the pain's like 2 out of 10. Well, perfect. We get some blood flow in to treat the area because blood flow to an area provides more nutrients and that assists in healing. So that's why we would get them to move. But we don't want to push them so hard that we aggravate the injury and worsen the scenario. So then what we might do is next week we go, okay, let's try the 7.5s, or let's try the 6s, or let's repeat that, and then the pain drops. Awesome, let's add more load. Let's say you're a fucking idiot, and then you put them straight onto the squat bar, and they're like, 7 out of 10. You're being too aggressive. So keep that in mind. That's one of the advantages of RPE, because given pain is subjective, using a subjective measurement makes sense, because it's a data point we need to think about. Wow, I love RPE, it seems. What are some of the negatives? I can't just be all wishy-washy. Well, this is probably your biggest critique if you're a percentage zealot. People are really bad at guessing how hard they train. This is RPE's biggest limitation. There was a study where it's like they basically got people to train to failure or estimate how many reps they had in reserve on a set. And they'd be like, 2 to 3. Oh, yeah, no, I couldn't do any more. And then what they did is they made them do the same weight, the same set. And they yelled and they went, go, 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 let's go. Like very strong encouragement. And they did like 5 to 10 reps more. So they reported having 2 to 3 left, but in actuality, they had like 10 reps in reserve or 5 reps in reserve. And so they were below intensity thresholds to grow muscle, And so people are really bad at guessing. And so it requires calibration, and this can take years to develop. Like if you're not training hard for especially if you're intermediate, like late intermediate, if you're not training hard enough, you just won't grow. Especially if you're advanced. If you're not training hard enough, guarantee no growth. And so why would we, if they don't know how to guess how hard they're training, why the hell would we do that? Like they're just not growing, And so it requires calibration. You need to know how hard you can actually train. And you need to put focus in your session so you train that hard, and that can take years. That's just the reality, It's the biggest letdown of RPE, despite its advantages. Sometimes, especially if you're a sub-junior, people use RPE to overshoot and go for PRs. You'll see a video and it's like RPE 8 with a misgroove, or like your client will send this video like, yeah, I was feeling really good today. I was expecting this to feel better, from my last warm up, and you see the last warm up and it was the RPE 8. And they go like, yeah, I was expecting it to feel better. I'm like, bro, no. You're just trying to use this to max out. It's like, thought it was going to be an 8, but it was like a 10. So no, bro, it's a fucking PR. Like you wanted to get a PR and you were just immature. So that's one of the limitations is the flexibility. It enables a high risk of poor decisions making. Like it allows for more poor load decisions, So just like with you and your ex-girlfriend, that was a poor load decision. Man, that was a terrible joke. But no, in seriousness, like people take advantage of the flexibility to push harder than when they should. So that's more like a immaturity thing, but it's still something to consider. Like you can't just tell us like a sub-junior, hey, RPE 7, and then and not expect them to max out. Okay. People use it to pretend not to train hard enough. Ooh, this is like the inverse of the problem. Saying it felt higher than what it truly was. So that's an example of people are bad at guessing how hard they're training. They just show up and they go, oh, that felt like really hard. ooh, ow. And in actuality, they just like experience the burn for the first time. And then if you yell at them a little bit, which you shouldn't be yelling at your clients, by the way, unless they want that, that's a weird relationship. Let's say, and then like basically you really, really encourage them, they'd smash out more reps, you know? People use it to not train hard enough. Or what they'll do is they'll pretend like they're training RPE 8 and then they'll program like 20 sets. And you're like, how the hell are you surviving through this entire workout when you're truly approaching RPE 8? It's like, you're not. You're just not training hard enough. So that's a problem as well. So elements of subjectivity can really manipulate the final load selection. So, you know, maybe you don't trust yourself to lift certain weights, and that's going to influence potentially how the lift is perceived. So, you know, 100 kilo club. First time you're going to hit 100 kilo bench, you know, it's only 5 kilos more than 95, but that's an extra number in front. Like, that's 3 digits. And that's 2 big red plates, or not 2 big red plates. That's 2 big plates, you know, and that can feel scary and daunting. It's like, do I know I have this? And then you kind of psych yourself out, and then it's heavier than what it actually is because you lack the confidence. So that's something that RPE can be problematic as well, is that, you know, like life influences and your perceptions influence how it's going to feel. So that's a problem. And, you know, you have to be proactive with your strategies to prevent that. Sometimes the lift can feel RPE 7, but you'll still be below the intensity thresholds for muscle growth or strength. So again, you know, you might lift it, be like only just amped enough, and be like, ooh, let's say you're in a strength block. You need it 75% above your 1 rep max, or no. So let me rephrase that. You're in a strength block. It's week 1. To reliably stimulate results, you need to be at or above 75% of your 1 rep max. You hit a set of 5 at 7, and it's like 65% of your 1 rep max. That's below the reliable intensity thresholds, you know, assuming that you didn't just come back from injury and things like that. Like, that's a problem. Like, relying purely just on RPE, sometimes issues happen and you don't get into the minimum intensity thresholds. Okay. Damn, bro. I just took a big dump on RPE. Let's talk about the advantages of percentage-based programming. So, it's standardized, it's reliable, it's very well researched, it's consistent. If you're above the intensity thresholds, you're reliably producing results. There's no questions. It's math. You know, calculations on volume progressions through a block become very easy. You know exactly what they're lifting, you know exactly how many sets, you can map everything out. Informing causality about recovery can be more objective. For example, you notice a big spike in volume because you're an idiot and you programmed wrong, or you expected them to recover from it. Or maybe week 3 you accumulated too quickly. And so, you know, the math is right there, and you can correlate recovery or how they feel. Let's say, like in the morning, they wake up and they go, fuck, you know, like you can correlate all that with your calculations. And so it becomes more objective in some way. If you know you're getting 2.5% stronger every week, you can build into PRs with a higher sense of certainty. For 8 weeks, 2 blocks in a row, you've been able to consistently add 2.5% to your 5 rep top set. And now it's week 9, let's say, and it's time to hit a PR for your top set. Well, you've been able to add that same weight for 8 weeks. It's like you're going to hit the PR. It's like you know what's going to happen. And so there's no uncertainty, unlike RPE, where it's like, how's this going to feel? It's like, well, guess what? It's going to feel good because it's been good for the past 8 weeks, you know, unless you've just broken up with like your boyfriend and, you know, because he was cheating on you with one of your homies. Why am I mentioning that? It's not even funny. That's very sad if that's happened to you. You thought he was your gym bro? No, he's just the gym hoe. damn, that's deep. But let's say something like that happens. It's like, unless that happens, it's pretty consistent that you're going to hit the PR. And it's also easy to diagnose the ideal strategy for your client. So RPE provides variability within the program, and that adds noise. Like if you take all the different strategies you can use for percentage, and one works better than the other because you can literally see quicker progress and better outcomes, then it's easy to diagnose that that's the best strategy at the moment. But RPE, it's like, now I got to account for variations in how you feel. It's like, I just want to see numbers so I can figure out the best option. So those are some benefits. And also, there's many ways to progress using percentage. You have like linear periodization where you increase percentage and then you decrease reps as well. And so volume's the same, but intensity is climbing. Or there's a step loading approach where you basically go, let's say, 5x5 at 70% for 2 weeks. And then you go 5x5 at 75% for 2 weeks. And then maybe 5x5 at 80%. Obviously, I'm just shooting numbers, but the idea is there's multiple ways to use percentage to cause progress, which is very, very, very cool. So what are the cons? Well, you have to have reliable 1-rep max calculations, which means maxing out, which means injury risk. And yes, you can use estimated 1-rep max calculations, but they might be wrong as well. And I'm going to hint at why they're wrong later, but keep that in mind. As you go week to week, your estimated 1-rep max and your 1-rep max become less accurate. You just get stronger, or you don't get stronger. Or actually, if you don't get stronger, they're still accurate. Or you get weaker, So how do you calibrate your 1-rep max without maxing out? It's like, it's based off your 1-rep max. So, keep that in mind. Good coaches know how to account for this, but it's something to think about. It's another problem to solve with this solution. And are you going to max out all your accessories? It's like, no, you shouldn't. You can just say, and you could just say go to failure, but then you've got the exponential fatigue problem. And so RPE solves the problem of accessories really well, especially things where it's like, okay, here's a perfect example. Every lat pull-down machine is different. They all have weird ways of progressing. One pin might be 2 kilos in one gym, the other one might be 5. How do you program, pin increases? You just can't. And so you have to rely on how the person feels, or get them to max out. But imagine maxing out a lat pull down. That would be embarrassing. If you tell your client to max out the lat pull down, you probably shouldn't be a coach. Okay, though you're progressing, let's say with percentage, maybe you're going close to failure, then maybe you should. Your stimulus to fatigue ratio through the weeks might not be ideal for the adaptation you're pursuing. And so your total raw stimulus magnitude will be lower because you can only handle so much fatigue. That's not optimal. You want the most stimulus, the least fatigue. And you want the most stimulus, you want certain amounts of stimulus in certain times of the block so you can maximize the overall stimulus. And if you're just constantly approaching failure or training way harder than you should to push percentage and not accounting for how you feel, well, there's that problem. Keep that in mind. If you're having a bad day, go get a hug. No, don't do that. We are men, and we are deprived of female touch because we don't need women, brother. No, seriously, you may not be able to hit the prescribed loads if you're feeling bad, But what else are you going to do? If you auto-regulate depending on how you feel that day, that's RPE. Notice how there's some, maybe we shouldn't be exclusive in these approaches. Think about that. You could feel much stronger or weaker than your percentage prescription. So, like, think about it. You hit 75%, feels like you could have done like 3 more reps. Or it feels like you could go on 80% and it would have felt how it should have. Or you just feel way heavier. So because you're capped at a certain percentage, you're missing out on gains, potentially, or you're piling up fatigue despite being under-recovered. So this is why estimated 1 rep maxes can be difficult. But percentages for everybody depends on factors such as fiber type, cardiovascular fitness, training familiarity. So for example, generally 90% of your 1 rep max is typically your 3 rep max. But for somebody else, that might be 85%. That's a big range. But how do you figure out these variations from normal? Because you've still got your 1 rep max, 2 rep max, 3 rep max, 4 rep max, all the way down to 10, where it's relevant still. How do you map out those percentages for everybody? Because fiber type is going to change the distribution of those percentages, if that makes sense. And so you can't figure it out without experience. And during the experimental phases of you and your client, you could be very off the mark, possibly risking maxing out too early. And so RPE allows us to figure this out using relative intensity. And then basically you can go, okay, so, this load felt like this at this rep range. This load felt like this at that rep range. And then therefore you can extrapolate, you can use that data and basically map out the percentage graphs. That's something you can do. Requires a little bit more thinking than just like potato head, but it's something you can do. And so also keep in mind, depending on your training cycle and depending on how you get your athlete to adapt to depending on what they're doing, you might need to reconfigure these percentages. If you start pushing strength volume, you might start resulting in more fast twitch fibers. And then so when they return to lower volumes, you might need to lower their percentage 1 rep max for particular rep ranges. You guess you could then redo the calculations and then figure it out, but then at that point, you're so invested in RPE, just use it. So yeah. And then again, what are you going to do in comp? If you're not using any form of auto-regulation, you're kind of less equipped to make confident decisions on the platform. That's just a reality. Okay. What is everybody using? Well, the top guys in Worlds and Nationals and the upcomers, they're using RPE. Just fundamentally. They are using RPE in their training because it has value. Most young guys, though, could benefit from learning percentage approaches because RPE solves the problem of relative intensity, they don't understand the absolute intensities that they need to hit. And then so they just be lazy with their programming, or they program others because they think they know their shit when they've got like a 3-plate deadlift, and it's just basically like a bunch of volume, some shitty accessories, and then RPE. It's like, ooh, I just dropped my phone. Oh, good, no cracks. Yeah, and so young guys will potentially benefit from actually learning the fundamental principles, because literature, intensity thresholds, is based on percentage, not RPE. And there is research on RPE, but fundamentally, it's a universal language. What is your percentage of 1 rep max? And you'll also learn about that through, let's say, energy system use. And so the young guys who want to actually be successful in coaching others or themselves should probably learn about RPE and should also learn, especially, about percentages. And then most old stale lifters with injuries all the time, they use exclusively percentage. Train hard, brother. I'm not adapting to this crap. They're just, you know what I mean? Like, they're just always like, RPEs for pussies, and then like they tear their pec on like a crappy bench or a mediocre bench by our times, but they'll insist they have America, like they hold a record in a federation nobody's heard of, made 5 years ago. So you don't want to be that guy. That's for sure. What should you use in powerlifting? Well, look, clearly, each approach has unique benefits. Maybe we should just use both. What? This is crazy. Ashton has given us all these facts and now is suggesting that we combine their benefits to remove the limitations. For example, why don't we prescribe percentage ranges and then use RPE auto-regulation? So that might be like, so week 1, we do a 3x4 with 75 to 80% of your 1 rep max, but what's going to feel like RPE 7. So you create the minimum threshold to actually progress, but you also allow for when things feel really good, you know? And then you also kind of cap the load to what's reasonable. And that's really cool because it keeps us in a consistent range. And then we can each individually map out data sets and go, is this a good idea? Is this not? Why not combine it like that? And then, you know, maybe week 2, we do 77.5 to 82.5 at RPE 8. Just things to think about. It's not the best approach, it's not the worst, it's just a good approach. You could also use RPE ratings when you collect your data for using a percentage progression model. Let's say they do 75% first week. Week 2 they do 77.5, but it was way heavier than what you wanted it to be. How do you know this? Well, you just, at the end of the session, you ask them the RPE. You get them to fill something out. And now you have more data. So let's say this problem is consistent. Well, maybe you need to use like a step loading approach. Or week 1, you need to lower the percentage. Just things to think about. It's about understanding that this is data. If calibrated, is a tool to use. And so, you know, this is the percentage rating data can also be useful in determining attempt selections in comp. If you're so set on percentages, you know, and then like even progression models during your mesocycle, you know, are you accumulating too quick? Are you accumulating too slow? How's your recovery at certain weeks, depending on RPE? Look, the reality is there's a million ways to apply these concepts. But just note, they don't need to be exclusive. I know, my mind is blown. And yours is probably too. I wish I was blown. And, you know, in my estimations, they shouldn't be exclusive. You know, we should be taking what we can. If you're a good coach, you look at all the tools in front of you and you learn about them and you understand them, benefits, limitations, you use what's appropriate. You combine tools. I don't understand why people are so dogmatic. They're like, yeah, I love percentages. Look, I got like this one client who's doing really well. It's like, imagine if he had some RPE stuff as well. It's like, just blows my mind. Anyways, that's the episode. It was a bit fun, but I'm also really tired because that was a lot of words. And hopefully I didn't speak too fast. And hopefully it all made sense. If not, if you think there's stuff I missed, please message me. Message me at FitBigStrong on Instagram or at deadlift.squat.bench on Instagram. And I'd love to hear your inputs. Thank you guys for listening. This has been episode 14. My name is Ashton Riddell from FitBigStrong. From the FitBigStrong podcast, I'm signing out.